Can we start? Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this session. It's great to be in Riga. It's a privilege to have this panel with me, which I'll introduce in a second. The session is called, Can Russia Remain, will Russia remain behind the Iron Curtain? How long it can remain behind the Iron Curtain? And I mean, there is a question whether Russia is actually behind the Iron Curtain, what kind of system it is. But we're not going to talk about nuclear, we're not going to talk about the war itself. We're going to turn to Russian society and Russian politics, although obviously all this connected, but you've heard enough, we've heard enough probably in other sessions. There are better people, much better people to talk about the security aspect. We have a fantastic panel. Gulnaz Sharafutdinova, who is a professor of Russian politics at Russian Institute at King's College London, who I've been reading with great interest Gulnaz's articles about Russian ideology, how it's been adjusting to this war. We have Professor Sergei Medvedev from Charles University in Prague, but also Free University in Riga, the author of a brilliant book called The Return of the Russian Leviathan, which got Pushkin Prize in 2021, and is just finishing the proofs, he told me, or going through the last revisions of a new book, War Made in Russia. The title couldn't be more timely, which is coming out sometimes in the spring at Cambridge University Press, and congratulations on both books. We have Kadyrov, who many of you I'm sure know, who's been looking at Russia, studying it from the Baltic perspective, but also from European perspective, who's at the European Council of Foreign Relations at the moment. And we're very, very lucky to have Ambassador Māris Riekstiņš, the Latvian ambassador in Moscow, who has an edge over all of us, and I think I'm going to turn to him first, who's just come from Moscow. The rest of us been more or less recently. Sergei and I were last in Moscow in March. Gulnaz further. I don't know, Kadri, when were you last in Russia?
Me?
Yeah.
Exactly 1 year ago.
So, a year ago. Just to say the things which I'd like to discuss, which I think hopefully will be of interest. We're now nearly at 8 months of this war. 24th of October will be exactly 8 months. And throughout this war there's been, and in the run-up to it, there have been difficulties of not so much intelligence and analysis, but of imagining or visualizing certain things. A lot of us who've studied Russia couldn't quite believe he would do it. Intellectually, we were arguing that this is likely to happen. When you actually face the reality of it happening, it's very hard to visualize Russian tanks, Russian missiles showering on Kyiv, on Ukraine. We couldn't quite imagine how Ukrainian army would fight back and that it would last, and not only last, but will turn into one of the, probably the strongest European army at the moment, this second to really none, to face what was supposed to be the second largest army. And now we're having some problems visualizing of how Putin goes and how this war ends. And we'll try to, I think, to imagine and to visualize some of those things, which perhaps not being able to do so holding us back. But before, given that unlike Russian propaganda, we try to operate with facts, and we have the fortune of having the ambassador with us who just came back from Moscow a couple of days ago. Could I turn to you to describe what is it like? We haven't seen Moscow since March. What does it feel like? And what's your sense of where we are in terms of the politics and the elites dynamic and the balance of power?
Well, thank you very much, Arkady. Thank you for a very kind introduction. Actually, it's not a surprise that coming here and when I meet my colleagues from Latvia and other countries, the first question comes, how is it to be a Latvian ambassador these days in Russia? And my usual answer goes like, I have a mixture of different feelings. From one hand, it is, of course, professionally very rewarding because, for instance, in my professional career, I never met that many Nobel Peace Prize laureates as in these years in Moscow. And I'm not speaking just about Mikhail Gorbachev, whose legacy in different corners of Europe might be considered differently, but also Dmitry Muratov and International Memorial just recently visited our embassy, the people who really defend the values, the universal values, and that professionally that's rewarding. But then at the same time there is a certain elements of depression, because again, I never met in my diplomatic career that many persons who are being followed and brought to jail, like for instance Vladimir Kara-Murza, who usually participated in these conferences in Riga because of their political beliefs. I have never met that many foreign agents, or actually in Russia to be declared a foreign agent, that means the enemy of the state. So that's pretty depressive. It's also pretty depressive professionally to see that, that the Russian authorities deliberately are dismantling the existing mechanisms of engagement with the West. You see that definitely through the propaganda channels, and in my job description, it belongs to my job description time to time to look at this black case in the corner of the room, the TV channels, but also in very practical steps like closure of the Russian representation at NATO, like the way how they welcomed High Representative Borrell to Moscow last year. The gossip right now in Moscow is that most probably Russians will not send a new ambassador to the European Union. But also in policy papers, we see the same deliberate closure of any mechanisms of cooperation, like national security strategy of Russia. In 2015, there were a number of areas where Russians believed some of the threats or challenges related to security, like terrorism, like global warming, they considered European Union and NATO as a potential partners. In 2021, even before the war, the new strategy, European Union is not even mentioned in that 40-page document, not to speak of NATO. So it's a clear evidence they are closing down the cooperation avenue.
Sure, but Māris, obviously, there are policy papers and there are politics, but actually being on the ground, yeah, you have the smell, the senses, what the place looks like. So throughout the summer, we've been getting reports that actually Moscow had been carrying on as normal. There was pretending a special military operation somewhere quite far. How has Moscow, or your sense of you talk to people, presumably still at even if at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, how has the mood changed since 21st of September when Putin called the mobilization, and how tense does it feel? What's your sense of the dynamic?
Well, you're right. I mean, before 21st of September, it was just a business for professional army, and the people should go on with their everyday businesses. And specifically talking about Moscow, Moscow perhaps will be the last place where you will see the results of sanctions or the very fact of war going on their western borders. After the mobilization or partial mobilization, definitely you feel a certain increase of nervousness if you trust the figures coming from the central bank. The people are withdrawing their money from their bank accounts. Definitely everybody knows about the reports regarding the people fleeing Russia. The figures are different. Some are talking about, like Forbes is talking about 700,000. The more modest figures are 300,000. Anyway, but that's a high number. If you add to 300,000 leaving Russia, escaping from mobilization, then 300,000 mobilized, poorly equipped, poorly prepared. I think when you look then at the labor market, that will have huge influence for the future.
The mobilization, and particularly the retreat from Kharkiv and the advance of Ukrainian forces, I think would agree, introduced the idea that actually Putin might not win amongst the Russian elite, that there are now, you know, there are pundits talking about the various losing scenarios. Sergei, if Ukrainian forces continue to advance, which we hope they will, and liberate the territory, throughout the next few months, I think the policymakers and particularly the military have a good idea of what's happening on the battleground, but everybody's having this difficulty imagining what does it do in Russian politics, how fast does Putin go. Let's say, for sort of scenario sake, Ukrainian armed forces get to the close to, or actually to the line of the 24th of February. The conventional wisdom has been, well, at that point, the defeat is so obvious, Putin loses power, this is it. Is this how it goes?
Thank you, Arkady. And it's a privilege for me to be speaking to this conference and this distinguished panel with the ambassador and so many good old colleagues. Let me challenge this whole line of thinking. What will Putin do? What will happen if Russia loses? Because, you know, it's Putin all over the place. You know, I'm flying here, I'm going through kiosks at every airport. There's Putin, Putin, Putin on all, you know, gracing all the covers of magazines. I mean, I go through the airplane, I see, you know, people are reading their smartphones. There's also like Russia and Putin. And my first message here would be like, try to forget Putin. Imagine we are in 1942, in 1943. And we're starting every discussion with, what will Hitler do if Germany loses? Shall Germany return to its, you know, Third Reich borders or to the old borders? So the problem in 1942, 1943, we knew that there's a clear enemy, that there's an existential threat to the world, which has to be extinguished, which has to be dealt with. And there was no talk of what will Hitler think and what will Hitler do. And I think we should take on the same approach to Putin. Stop thinking about what is in his head, what is in his mind. We should just do our act as the West, as the people who want to save humankind from this threat. So my first thing what I want to say here is that this is definitely not Putin's war. Let me just, you know, these 5 minutes that I'm allotted, speak as a historian, because I teach political history, and try to look at it from a historical point of view. And from a historical point of view, this is not an accident that this war happened. Okay, it's a unique coincidence of circumstances that brought Putin to power. But in essence, this is a war of entire Russian history. That's one of the high points of Russian history, which hopefully has to end. This period of Russian history has to end at this point. This is, first of all, the history of the past 20 years, 21 years, 22 years, the history of Putinism, Russia which has arose from the debris of the Soviet Union. Secondly, that's the history of the past 30 years. That's the delayed Soviet breakup. We were marveling so much after 1991 how bloodlessly the Soviet Union had collapsed, especially compared to Yugoslavia, right? Especially looking at what was happening in Rwanda at the moment, at other imperial breakdowns. We were really wondering how could it happen so peacefully and velvetly, right? Was the nuclear missiles decided, issue decided, was NATO being enlarged rather bloodlessly, and so on. But so now what we're facing, it's a delayed Soviet breakup from 1991. What hadn't happened in 1991 is happening now, the painful imperial breakup. And then this is more than this. This is the end of a long history that started in 1917, which is called the breakup of the Russian Empire, which tried to break up twice, in 1917 and 1991, and never it broke completely. Each time there was an imperial remission. The Stalinist remission in the 1930s and the 40s, and then the Putinist remission in the 21st century. So this is an unfinished history of Russian imperial breakup. 20th century was the century where all empires had ended. The British Empire, the French Empire, the Third Reich, whatever, the Belgian Empire, the Dutch Empire, and only one empire remained standing, which is the Russian Empire. It lived on into the 21st century. It's become an anachronism. And what we're seeing now is the anachronism of war, the anachronism of the imperial breakdown. And finally, what breakdown we're facing, I think it's a history of not just 350 years of Russian Empire, because really, well, Russia started to be called empire in 1721 after the Northern War by Peter the Great. But indeed, it became empire in 1654 after Ukraine became part of Russian Empire. And actually, Zbigniew Brzezinski had a very precise judgment on this. He says, without Ukraine, Russia ceases being an empire. So the fate of Ukraine is indeed the fate of Russian Empire. Therefore, we're seeing such ferocity. Therefore, we're seeing such destruction, because Ukraine is a pivot. Ukraine is a cornerstone in the building of the Russian Empire. So take out Ukraine and the entire imperial building collapses. And finally, what kind of breakup we're facing? I think it's a breakup of 550 years. It's a breakup of Muscovy. That's Muscovy, which we're seeing now, which emerged from the Tatar yoke. The Muscovy, which emerged, by the work of Ivan III, Ivan IV, the construction of the Kremlin, and that's when the Moscow Principality, in alliance with the Tatars, rose among the Russian principalities and started to iron out the entire Russian land, building its dominance. So we're facing these multiple breakups: the breakup of Muscovy, the breakup of the Russian Empire, the breakup of Soviet Empire, and the breakup of Putinism, all together in 1 year. So what it drives me to say that we're really facing a shift of historic magnitude, which is much more than Putin, which is an existential challenge for the West. It's a challenge which the West hadn't faced for 80 years. It's the same thing which the Third Reich posed to the Third World. So in a way, and this will be probably my main message here, is that we're facing the task of 1945. The Russian cars, you've seen this ambassador so much in Moscow. There are many cars driving with the stickers saying 1945, 1941, 1945. Можем повторить. We can repeat it. So that was the main Russian line. We can repeat 1945. So let me just finish. So I think the bottom line for the West is the West has to repeat 1945. It's an unfinished job. There were two big empires in 1945, which were threatening the free world. This was the German Reich, and this was the Stalinist Soviet Union. And only one was defeated in 1945. And the second one survived and resurrected, and once again poses the same challenge to the free world. So the world has to understand, NATO has to understand, the West has to understand that it is facing the challenge of the same scope, of the same magnitude, and it should come up with the same response as it did in 1945. So this would be, and if then we have the time, I have sort of a small.
We'll definitely come back. Thank you for that. I agree with the argument of the sort of the historic. I completely agree with the argument of this is the order of the magnitude, and this is the scale. We are seeing the end or penultimate and ultimate episode of something that you could date it. You could say 1920s, you could say it 1914, 1917. We could argue about that. I agree with that. But people who actually live, given that we're in the active war, people don't think in, those who live their lives don't think in terms of the big historic narratives. They think about their own lives. I had a conversation with Alexei Navalny, who, just before he went back to Moscow, who said, what gives me strength is I know that I'm riding the wave of history, that Putin's trying to reverse it, but actually time and history is moving against him. Russia was we saw it as a sort of a modernizing society, urban, middle class, growing, etc. The question is this really Putin's war? Is this really Russia's war? Is this Putin's war? In a sense that if you came out on the street at any point before the war, and you said, do you really want Kherson back? I very much doubt that the vast majority of Russian people would say, yeah, we really can't live without it. We desperately want Kherson or Donetsk or Mariupol. And we also know that the war is not particularly popular. In fact, we know that it is unpopular, even though Putin continues to draw support. You know, Russian trends were going in the right directions, you know, alcoholism going down, society modernizing. Even the attitude to LGBT was constantly improving. Gulnaz, so Putin is now, is this Putin's war? Is it Russia's war? Is he losing that war of history? And what does he need to do to stay in power as far as he's concerned and how you see it?
Yes, thank you. All right, it will be hard to talk after very passionate.
But let's try to bring it back into today.
Yes, I think one, just in response to Sergei's historical vision of this war, one interesting counterfactual to add to this discussion is whether, because it's a discussion about inevitability of this war, right? And Sergei is a historian, I'm a political scientist, and so I'll add the political science's perception of the elephant in picture here. Would this war happen if Putin left power in 2008? That's a big question, right? And if we go this path, it brings us to away a bit from history, but to the more contemporary political realities of Russia being an intensifying, deinstitutionalized personal dictatorship with whatever shortcomings, pitfalls, short-sightedness that personal dictatorships experience, not just Russia's personal dictatorship, but personal dictatorships around the world. So I think that would be an additional aspect of looking at this war. It's really talking about the unsuccessful democratization of Russia and what caused that, right? Why Russia that went on the path of democratization early on in the 1990s wasn't able to go that way, and we saw an intensifying authoritarianism that today we see the institutionalized dictatorship where everyone looks into one person and try to find out what that person thinks. So besides the historical aspect, I think it's important to bring in this institutional aspect of what the country is about, how it has evolved, and it will be important to think at the point when we will have potential conversation about new Russia, if it is there to be, or whatever other many Russias might be there. So that's the institutional aspect. But to talk about the war and to understand the nature of war, it's important to think about how do we make sense of Russian society, because before war and around 2018, there were very strong statements about how in Russia we have a case of a very modernized society that travels abroad, that uses internet, the internet coverage was the highest, the ownership of mobile telephones was highest among many European states. So you had a lot of these modern aspects, and of course, many of you, I do not doubt, have experienced the beauty of new museums and very rich musical and theatrical scene in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and having experienced these beauties of modern Russia, how do we make sense of why Russia is embroiled in such a brutal war today and even acquiesces or even supports that war, right? So that's the big question that I believe many of us in the West have to try to make sense of. How is it possible? And I've started thinking about this issue from around 2013, but certainly from 2014, when I saw a big gap between perceptions of what's happening in Russia, with Crimea, in Russia and outside Russia. And my path of thinking brought me to understanding the importance of collective identity politics that Putin and the Kremlin have promoted starting around 2011, 2012, after 2012, when the Kremlin faced the challenge of modernizing Russian society, those angry urbanites on the streets asking for political participation, asking for their voice to matter, the Kremlin came up with a strategy of juxtaposing big mother Russia with all its peripheries to these angry urbanites, and to talk not about accountability, limited government, democracy, or voice, but to talk about millennial Russian history, Russian greatness, and whatever great moments in Russian history, and how Putin was able to strengthen Russia on the back of the perceived chaotic, anarchic 1990s. And this identity politics, one of its very important elements was building the enemy. That Russia, this great country, is actually surrounded by the enemies that tried to come and fragment and destroy Russia in the 1990s, and that will not stop unless we stop the West from destroying Russia. And it is this narrative that has turned into really a mainstream narrative from around 2014, is the narrative that built the contemporary sense and understanding that many Russians have about what the war is about and how they should articulate their opinions about the war. So if they believe in Russia being surrounded and the war being existential for Russia, then protecting Mother Russia is one of the duties to the state.
Gulnaz, but you're talking about that active, let's call it sort of civic nationalism, civic participation, volunteering projects, all that stuff we saw in 2011 and 12 on Bolotnaya in Moscow in the protests. A lot of these people are either gone, some of the leaders are in jail, the rest are silenced. The other part of the population that actually has been given Putin united Russia, that legitimacy, that supermajority, have been told for many, many years, stay out of politics. Elections are a dirty game, don't bother, we'll sort it out, and this is a contract, just get on with your life and don't involve yourself. He's now calling to people to mobilize and go to war and to die. How does this work?
Yeah.
Disengage society in a state of mobilization.
Yeah, that's exactly. Depoliticization was sort of another important element of, that was combined with identity politics. So Putin is the leader who represents and builds and creates success for great Russia, but don't trust politics and don't trust other politicians. But when your country is in danger, the call to arms in Ukraine does work to bring some people who are depoliticized to start with, and hence they see the war as an existential issue from their side. So depoliticization works really well in combination with this collective national identity politics, because national identity politics will not work on those individuals who have made it, who have succeeded in creating businesses, in having actualized their professional individual identities and have many more things in their life than to compensate for their sense of loss and sense of poverty with sort of building pride from Russia as a state and Russian successes. So collective identity politics works really well with the depoliticization strategy.
Sergei, you wanted to come in.
Yes, I just wanted to add in shortly. I'm also really amazed seeing, fellow countrymen just absolutely humbly receiving this, notices of mobilization, and then, packing up, and then their wives and their families are buying them, €1,000, €2,000 worth of equipment with the scarce money which they have, and then they just go to the collection points and disappear in this black doors of Voenkomat, of this military precinct, of buses, of trains, and go there, like every fifth of them will be killed. Every second will be wounded, according to statistics. That were the recent losses. So this humbleness has really amazed me. And it really, what I think really along also Gulnaz's lines, war is an essential part of Russian identity. I would say war is a part of Russian national idea. And it was like Putin's evil genius that he did. I mean, Russia was looking for the so-called nationalная idea, the national idea, for the past 30 years. There were like many candidates. But then, 2022 comes up Putin and says, okay, guys, you've got war. And suddenly the nation goes to war. And I'm amazed at how the administration works, how the elite works, how the common population... Have we seen many defectors from the elite? Have we seen any top businessmen? Have we seen any top administrator? No. Everyone just marches to the drum. I was amazed. I studied this country for 30 years. And, I'm amazed in 2022, the way that the country fit into the war like a hand into a glove. But I would say, yeah.
But at the same time, we see people fleeing through the border, we see people sabotaging, stepping down. Let me bring Kadyrov in.
Arkady, it's 1%. I calculated the protest plus emigration roughly amounts to 1.5 million people. But it's 1% of Russian population.
That's true, but if we look at the polling data, we also see that as soon as he announced mobilization, all the indicators, the confidence, the optimism, is Russia going in the right direction or wrong direction, drops sharply, including Putin's rating. Kadyrov, you've been looking and studying Russia for many years, talking to the Russian elite, to Russian society. From where you're looking, how successful do you think the mobilization can be, and at what point in this war are we in terms of the Putin's ability to hold on to power?
I think the clock is ticking. I don't know how long he has left. That can vary depending on various circumstances, including how the war is going. But I think one thing I am fairly confident about is that now, since February, we are in the situation where I think Putinism will go with Putin. Earlier...
Putinism will go with Putin?
Yes, because earlier I thought there was a fair chance that the system he created could outlast him, and it could evolve with some changes into something more sustainable, being also slightly more accountable, slightly more institutionalized, but not sort of full-fledged Western democracy with everything that involves, but sort of a system that can function in a long-term manner. I think there was potential for that. Now, however, I am fairly sure that change when it comes will be disruptive in some ways. And that system will be gone and replaced with something else which is can take various shapes. It's not necessarily nice and cuddly for us. But yeah, I have been thinking of how the change could happen. I think Stalin's death is a model we should be paying attention, because Stalin's system was another sort of hyper-personalized, because otherwise it's not sort of historically necessarily feature of Russian system. I mean, Soviet Union actually had more power centers than today's Russia. It had Communist Party, it had KGB, Politburo was sort of collective decision-making organ in the way they don't have now. And after Stalin's death, what you saw then, there was some power struggle with fairly unholy personalities weighing in, and we will surely have that if something happens to Putin. You'd have, I mean, Kadyrov will want to be in the role of kingmaker and some others. So we will probably see a period of that, but then, you could expect Russia to go back into sort of slightly more collective form of leadership. Because I think this war, I mean, it is true that many features of the society have enabled the war, but that said, it is still Putin's idea. It's his obsession. Without his obsession, it would not have happened. It's not that Russia's elite wanted to take Kherson, as you asked earlier.
So can I ask you a follow-up question on that? So because you brought the point, after Stalin's death, the system, the socialist system, the communist system, whatever you want to call it, stays in place. It develops some internal opposition to Stalinist wing. There is, power struggles within the party, within the Central Committee. There is a generation of people who think, well, if we can get rid of the Stalinist legacy, we can still repair the system. This is what Gorbachev comes with in the 1980s. Is there a difference now in that nobody actually can see the system, nobody can see the future and the destination, and therefore there are actually very few people within the system who could say, well, if Putin goes, we can preserve whatever this is, that Putinism is a system? Or is it simply a mafia ring, and once he goes, whichever way it happens, the whole thing unravels?
It can go in different ways, but I think many in the current elite would actually want to sort of cut the losses, stop the war, and see, what can be saved of the system. I also don't see many very prominent challenges right now. Opposition was weak already when it was out in freedom. Now most of them have been jailed or exiled. I do not see many challenges among the elites who would sort of have potential for public politics. And that to me is a difference compared to Soviet period, because I grew up in the dying years of the Soviet Union, and then actually you had many elite members who were capable of getting their own followership, their own agenda, having an impact on the system. And that's what we saw during Perestroika time. Now I don't see that sort of people in the Russian elite. It could be that they are somewhere in the shadows, behind the curtain.
Not this
exactly, one. Back there. And ready to step out when circumstances permit. That could be the case as all, So I oftentimes think that if someone had visited, say, even Estonia in 1987, would they have seen necessarily all these sort of pride politicians waiting in the wings? They were all there. They were not well known. Would you be able to identify them? I don't know. But yeah.
Māris, could I turn to you? Of all of us, you actually have to write dispatches. Governments make, they read them, they make decisions and plan on the basis of what you do. There was a famous long telegram that Cannon wrote in 1946, advising Truman that Stalinism is not what Russians really want, and Russians want the same thing as everybody wants, and therefore you have to have patience and you have to contain. But it's actually Stalinism is not what the whole of Russia is about. In your view, and when you write and when you advise, how do you, if you were to write today a telegram on which a lot of things hinged, what would you say? Is it his war? How does it end? How does it affect the system? And what comes after?
Oh, I would definitely suggest to read once again this long telegram from, 1947, I guess?
46.
Or 46, but I would write that that apparently, as we speak, we cannot see any slightest sign that, and I would say collective Kremlin, and I agree with Professor, this is not just about Putin, this is about the more broad support for this war. So far we have not detected any slightest sign that they are about to amend or change strategic objectives of this operation. I don't see it right now. Therefore, we have to be ready for a long haul. We have to understand, and I think in this whole we understand, that largely the failure of Russian military operations so far is because of a couple of factors. One is definitely the Ukrainian readiness, willingness, ability to fight, defend, and eventually liberate their country. Second is very united position of the Western community supporting Ukraine. And we have to continue to support Ukrainians, and we have to keep this unity intact. The third element is, of course, about the motivation, and this is more for understanding the latest decisions of the Russian leadership. For instance, mobilization, I think this is also largely because of motivation. So Ukrainians are winning the war so far or defending successfully their territory because the motivation is much higher than for the Russian soldiers, because they are defending their land, their families, their kids. So those Russians fighting for money, well, I would say this is much lower motivation. Mobilization brings what? It brings, and I think that's one of the idea behind this partial or total mobilization, is that it brings this war to every single home. And I think the desire behind this, it is that this becomes a war of the nation. And then, by defending your territory, then you try to raise the level of motivation for Russian soldiers fighting the war.
Gulnaz, can I ask, so if Putin tried to turn what was special military operation 8 months into the Great Patriotic War, what are the chances of him succeeding to paint it as a national effort?
I think what we see since September 21st is that mobilization effort has not been very successful from the perspective of the state and state authorities. We saw many people who are more resourceful, who find different exits, either from the country or circumventing the rule or buying special paperwork to avoid the draft. And so it's only the peripheral, poorer, frequently rural areas which become the source of the draftees that do not have political agency or do not see any freedom of action or any choice to exit the situation. In terms of mobilization, psychologically speaking, and support for it, all the public opinion surveys show extreme radical growth of anxiety, fear, and anger. Those three emotions seem to dominate. These emotions are, of course, internalized, and again, depends on the resources that you have, whether you go and, become join the army or you try to exit the situation. And no strong sort of moral support or psychological, what we saw after Crimea in terms of the excitement and joy, so such emotions are not present at all. So if anything, there is a big resistance and fear and anxiety with regards to mobilization.
Sergei, if Putin is seen, mobilization doesn't work and he doesn't manage to turn it into a Great Patriotic War, which I agree with Gulnaz, I don't think he can any Russian leader survive a visible defeat on the battleground? Can he retain power? Just going back to the beginning, can he stay in power when the elite of the people seeing that after 8, 10, 12 months, he is back to the line of 23rd of February at the very least and possibly further? Can he survive?
I think Russia can survive any sort of defeat. Russia survived the defeat of the Russo-Japanese War.
No, not Russia, but Putin.
But actually, Putin can suffer a defeat as well. We've seen Saddam, suffering defeat and still staying in power. So no, this is perfectly, you see, the political situation is perfectly under control. And just getting one step back to the question, to this, metaphor of Stalin's death, which Kadyrov evoked. There was a wonderful comedy, remember, a couple of years ago by Armando Iannucci, The Death of Stalin? But I think it's also good for political scientists to watch, because we see the work of Soviet institutions. It's very much about institutions and the hierarchies which stays behind each of the protagonists there. And it's very interesting then how the army takes over, how the KGB works. And this is the key difference between the situation of 1953 and the situation 2022. In a way, Putin has amassed even more power than Stalin did in his time. Stalin still had some institutions around him, influence but around him. Putin has none. He is absolutely burned out. There's no Russian politics as such. It's just Putin's body. It's like medieval political theology by, Ernst Kantorovich, Two Bodies of the King. It's like in the middle of medieval France. There's the king, king in parliament, and there's, the king is the embodiment of Russian politics. So Russian politics is inside Putin's body. So once Putin is gone, I mean, I think this will be totally, it's like forecasting a quantum situation. I can't, for the first time in my life, I say I cannot forecast what happens after Putin. Who will take over, what happens. There's so many small things that work now. And actually, yeah, since I don't have so much time, I just wanted to bring my last point, which is like homework. I don't know in which way Russia will collapse or what will happen to the system, but I know what has to be done. And here, let me just bring back the image of Germany in 1945. And there was an allied program of like rebuilding Germany of 5, I think, denazification, demilitarization. So I think what Russia needs to face after this, this whole crisis is over is, I think it's 7 Ds, which is de-Putinization, de-fascization or denazification, because I think Russia is really not just a fascist but a Nazi country with respect to Ukraine, and Ukrainians just take so much in the head of Putin as Jews had in the head of Hitler. Demilitarization, denuclearization. This is very essential, the denuclearization of Russia, because really between us today and the future stays one big unponderable, which is Russian nuclear missiles. Let me just finish. De-imperialization, decentralization, which is essentially demoscovization, and finally democratization of Russia. It's too much to ask, I know.
Well, it's not the question whether it's too much to ask, it's who you ask for. Because the big difference between Germany in 1945 and Russia is that Germany was occupied. Germany was defeated completely to capitulation on the battleground. Russia is a large country with nuclear arms. The chances of somebody occupying, the troops being in Moscow, is very close to zero. So whatever happens has to happen internally. So, Gulnaz, can Russia, just going back to the beginning, can Putin, if he survives, as Sergei suggests, as Saddam did after Iran-Iraq war, can he turn Russia into Iran? Would he need an ideology? What would it look like? You've got about 1.5 minutes.
Well, I think he has already turned Russia into a sort of an Iran at this point. There are problems entering, there are problems exiting, and there is a population that feels isolated from the rest of the world and feels pitted against the rest of the world. So from that perspective, the war is the ultimate, strongest instrument of juxtaposing a country to the outside world, especially if the outside world is perceived as an enemy. So, war could be an instrument from that perspective. So he has been successful in doing that, yes?
Kadri, you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, no, just a side remark to what Sergei said. I absolutely agree that Russia needs to rethink very many things, but I think we should be cautious about how we talk about it. I mean, I can see that some audiences in the West are more than happy to discuss collapse of Russia and, yeah, denuclearization as if we are gonna go and make that happen. We are likely not. And, Russia will survive Putin and Putinism. I don't think Russia will fall apart. I see no preconditions for that, nor I don't think we should necessarily wish for that to happen. And maybe that needs to be articulated more clearly here and there, because Putin is trying to spin that war as a war against Russia, existential one. He's having some success in that among population, but also among the elites who really should know better. And I think the people who are in the position to set policies and message on behalf of the West should make that quite clear, that, collapse of Russia, fall apart of Russia is not something we want.
May I just retort quickly? So that's really, these 7 points which I rose, this is not really a realistic political program, right? But I think that any Russia, and I agree with Kadri that Russia will remain. I mean, there's nobody else who will take care of this frozen expense in the world. I don't see this, any sane empire or nation intervening and taking over parts of Russia. It has to stay. It will stay in one different format. But I mean, any kind of Russia that emerges after, any kind of West, will have to think along these lines, which I mentioned. So these are the key problems which have to be addressed. And if they are not, Russia will be forever a challenger.
So let me ask, we're going to open to the floor in a second. In 20 seconds, each of you, we do this thing called the world in, the Economist does the world in 2023, sometimes we'll look ahead. Russia in 2028. Just whatever you want to say in one sentence. Is Putin there? Is Russia democratic? Is Russia Iran? Māris.
Well, Arkady, sorry, I have to go back the day after tomorrow to Russia and continue my functioning there. I mean, no, I think I would tend to agree with Kadri that I don't see that Russia is about to fall apart. What kind of Russia we will see, it depends largely at the end result of this war, and it will depend largely on how Russian society and Russia will deal with those people who've been enablers and committing the crimes, whether they go through the legal processes. Evidence is plenty, I mean, available on all these gadgets, and sometimes I really wonder why the people coming from State Duma, deputies, are talking like that on TV channels, genocidal talk about Ukrainians to be, I mean, starved and things like that. So that's important, that's essential, how the Russians will clean them up. So that's the main thing.
That's very diplomatic. Kadri.
I don't know what we will have. The only thing I'm fairly confident that it will probably look more different from today than if we think back to 2016, 17. I mean, same amount of way back. Change will be bigger.
Sergei?
Russia intact as a more or less single space. Putin either dead or most likely exiled, hidden somewhere in China, in one of Chinese provinces, or in the less likely scenario, somewhere in The Hague. Russia, although it is sovereign, it is in effect a economic, political, and the geopolitical province of China.
Okay, Gulnaz.
My guess is that short to medium term, and 3 to 5 years, Putin is still there. Situation is ongoing of conflict. If there are changes to happen, which there are, I don't see them happening before 10 to 15 years.
Okay. This is recorded. So in 2028 at Riga conference, I hope we can play back those comments. There are lots of questions. I saw James Scher's hand first. So James, can I turn to you?
Thank you. Sergei mentioned a very well-known axiom of Zbigniew Brzezinski. There is an alternative axiom, which I think is closer to the truth. Russia can remain an empire without Ukraine, but it cannot remain Russia. I think that is Putin's view and the view of the collective Putin. The defining feature of Russian imperialism is not territorial expansion. It has been the incorporation of the history and the identities of other peoples into Russia's identity and the annihilation of their historical memory. And that has been a deliberate state project. Catherine the Great described the objective of her Novorossiya campaign as the elimination of the memory, the eradication of the memory of the Ukrainian hetmanate. So my question is this, mainly to you, but also to others. To what extent, thanks to this war, do you believe that people have now started the painful process of decoupling Russian identity from this older historical identity which you outlined so persuasively? Thank you.
Thank you, James. Sergei.
Yes, James, a great question, thank you. And indeed, Russia, it's a paradox, but without Ukraine, the so-called, the borderland, Ukraine, the small Russia, the new Russia, whatever you called it in the Russian language, it ceases being Russia that we know. So the end result should be really coming up with a Russian identity, which never happened. Empire killed a nation. Russia still did not imagine how to live not being an empire. Geoffrey Hosking, the British historian, had a great quote, Britain had an empire, but Russia was an empire, and perhaps still is. So Russia still didn't learn how to live not being an empire. And I think this war will finally offer Russia a solution, how to imagine itself not being an empire.
Let's collect a few more questions. There is a question here, and while you're passing the microphone, I'll also read the question which is on the screen. So can we have a microphone here, which is from Anonymous. Why Ramzan Kadyrov and Yevgeniy Prigozhin allowed so flagrantly circumvent the rule of law? Kadri?
That's easy, because rule of law does not matter. The Kremlin circumvents the rule of law. What matters is loyalism, and as long as you're loyalist, you can do that. Rule of law will be applied harshly against those who are not loyal.
Thank you.
Irina Kuznetsova, I'm on the board of LATE and a co-founder of a democracy festival here in Latvia. My question goes to both of the professors, and we've been speaking about Russia as a spin dictatorship or electoral autocracy, but somehow I feel that here in the West, we've been avoiding naming Russia as a fascist state, because I feel as a civic activist that fascism has been on the rise in Russia, and I think I'm not alone. There are some few people, as maybe you, Sergei, or distinguished American historian Timothy Snyder, argue that fascism has arrived. Am I wrong or not? If it hasn't arrived, should we be prepared that it will be in the future?
Great question. We had on the cover in the August, Russia is in the grip of fascism. Gulnaz, is Russia fascist?
So one big factor that stops me from calling Russia a fascist state is the consistent and methodical depoliticization of the society that has occurred over the past many years, with fascism, one of the definitions being a mobilized society energized towards action. We don't see that energizing and mobilizing. We see a building of very relationships between the leader who sort of sees himself and whom people see as an embodiment of the nation, and the nation that is said, do your own stuff, get mortgages, consume, I'll take care of the things for you in the political section. So that's the big difference.
Mobilization lacking. Sergei?
Very briefly, yes, this is a debate started off by Tim Snyder, and actually he came up with the definition of schizofascism, like calling fascist the other, while you yourself being fascist. I sometimes spoke of cargo fascism, or retro-fascism, which has in Russia. But Gulnaz is right that there's always, we were saying, there's one vital element lacking, which is mobilization. We don't see the marching masses. We don't see the triumph of the will, like the Leni Riefenstahl movies. But after 21st of September, it changed. I think now we already see, not maybe so enthusiastically, but the nation marching into the military barracks. So I think we are getting closer to the real fascism, without the ideology, but still it's a 21st century fascism, what we see in Putinism.
Thank you. A question at the front.
First time.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Okay, I'm Nina Kotelashvili from Georgia. I represent a research organization called Soviet Past Research Laboratory. My question goes to all panelists, and there was mentioned the preconditions, that we don't see exact preconditions of Russia falling apart, and I'm interested, what are the exact conditions when it comes to just notice? Great.
Given that how short we are, can we have one more question, then we'll collect them, and then we'll do two at the same time.
Hi, Andrew Mick of the Marshall Center. So very fascinating discussion, and most of the parameters you have laid out they always start with D, denazification, decomposition, defeat, and all of that. Would you consider another scenario that we may see that does not have that agency and transformation, right? Because I think in what you said, that all these D scenarios assume that in some shape or form, Russia is in effect controlled directly or indirectly. What if the net outcome of this is simply Russia imploding onto itself and becoming this blob on the border of Europe with no agency on the part of the United States or desire to actually do much beyond that? But that's the blob you have to live with. And so you have, in effect, a semi-failed state in relative perpetuity, if there is such a thing, on Europe's border, without all the Ds, these, no agency in there, just stasis. And what does that mean for security of the continent? Thanks.
I was going to finish on something optimistic. We're actually going to, we are slightly running out of time, but this is such an important question, both of those actually. In fact, they're very related. Who wants to take that?
I can take the first question. In that respect, to me, it's instructive to think of a conversation I once had with someone from the Levada Center, a long-time employee who said that in late 80s, early 90s, they couldn't actually even conduct public opinion surveys across the Soviet Union any longer because these republics were living in sort of different worlds. The question you can ask in one place cannot be asked in another place, or it means something totally different. And he says that this is when he understood that this country was not going to survive in that kind of shape. And there is nothing like that in today's Russia. I mean, it still functions pretty much as unitary state, even though it's federation. I mean, you have sort of exceptional cases like Chechnya, or that has clearly its own type of governance, maybe to put it mildly. But otherwise, the bulk of Russia is very much one country, and frankly, I don't see separatism. I think even also much of the separatism we did see during the 1990s was inspired more by sort of bargaining, renting, getting a better deal with the center than the actual desire to go away. I think Chechnya, at the time with Dudayev or Maskhadov, Chechnya maybe really was the only one.
Sergei, Russia, big blurb with no agency?
Yes, actually, Andy, I think this is the most likely scenario. All my Ds are really like wishful thinking. I'm just thinking of the parameters which have to be changed for Russia to join whatever, the big community of nations. And therefore, the issue of denuclearization will come up eventually at some point. And I think this will be a point of negotiation of the West, of the world, with whatever leadership is in Moscow as a condition of normalization, as the lifting of sanctions, and so on. Because most likely, yes, Russia will be a big toxic bog with some sort of, isolation walls between Russia and the West. Still a single space, answering the question from a Georgian colleague. I don't see the breakup of Russia Yugoslav style, or even Georgia style. I don't see the identities in place. I don't see the external players in place that would be in charge of, this sort of Russian breakup. So yes, this will be still the big space on which these 6 magic letters will be written: Russia, Россия. But it will be much less predictable and more diverse lifestyles, big cities, a dozen of big cities connected by railways, and then there's, the big bog in between those. So this will be a very diverse, toxic, and unpredictable story for decades to come.
You can always count on historians to give you an optimistic note to end on.
With
that,
scenario.
we've run out of time. I found it incredibly
too
interesting.
vague to be a scenario.
I found it incredibly interesting and really useful in terms of just thinking. Obviously, we're never going to answer all the questions, but sometimes asking the right ones helps. Thank you to great panelists. Thank you to the audience, and I think we're completely out of time. Thank you.